This is episode 3 in the Trauma Unpacked series, Trauma in Senior Citizens, with clinical psychologists Rob Hamilton and Deborah Olusola.
The content of this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. It is not a substitute for professional therapy or mental health services. If you are experiencing emotional distress or need support, please consult a licensed mental health professional.
Welcome to Conversations on the Couch. My name is Deborah Olusola, and I'm a clinical psychologist. And today we have the always bright, always cheerful Rob Hamilton. And he's also a clinical psychologist. And today we're going to be talking about trauma amongst the elderly individuals. Rob, you are most welcome today. Thank you.
Lovely to be here, Deborah.
You are most welcome. You are most welcome. Today's topic is quite interesting. We have been, speaking about trauma. This is our trauma series. And I think this aspect is going to be very important for the community and for the society at large to get better insight to and get some psychoeducation about, what some of the older or elderly individuals go through, and not to necessarily look at it in isolation, but on a more broader scale, if I can say so. So thank you for being part of this conversation, and we look forward to learning a lot from you, and I guess your experience of working with, maybe if you have, with elderly individuals. So I want us to begin by, just speaking about how common are some of these, traumatic experiences amongst the elderly. For example, like sexual or physical, emotional kind of traumas. How often, how common, do they talk about it? Is it underreported? Who reports it? I think that would be something we would all like to sort of get a better understanding of.
I think that mental health issues amongst elderly people generally are underreported, and there isn't a lot of research to really give us a bigger picture, because older people tend to conceal mental health issues. They also tend to not talk about them directly. So I think trauma is also underreported and considerably under treated, certainly not often diagnosed. But about 1 in 10 people are likely to experience some form of trauma. Elderly people, 1 in 10 experience it. And interestingly, in the States, incidence of trauma doubled during the COVID pandemic.
Really?
Amongst old people.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm not sure if it's the same in other parts of the world, but I think that the actual restrictions of COVID were really difficult for elderly people.
Yeah. And it was a very difficult time. And everybody was cooped up in their houses or homes or in a old age home, and people were stressed. And correct me if I'm wrong, I guess people were taking their frustrations out on others,
especially the elderly. Because they had the most difficult restrictions, and often care homes didn't allow anybody in to visit for quite a long period of time, which was quite hard.
Yeah. Can imagine. And do the elderly find it difficult to talk about that abuse that they go through? And if they do, how come?
I think there's more stigma about trauma and abuse amongst elderly people. Isn't quite the same comfort about talking about mental health issues. Yeah. So they're more likely to not reflect it directly, but talk about physical symptoms, talk about gastrointestinal problems or headaches or sleep problems, rather than mention emotional issues. That's often how it comes to the fore. And so unless a caregiver or a health professional pays attention, they're likely to not really notice it.
Yeah.
I think younger people have got used to mental health services, and I think with older people it's been a much slower process. Elderly people have an attitude of, well, get on with life, just got to get over it.
Yeah, I guess that's from their, would it be their worldview or school of thought? But I mean, it at the end of the day, they are human beings, and it takes a huge toll on them. And I guess, moving on to the next question then, how do we distinguish or differentiate between, psychological trauma amongst the elderly versus geriatric trauma?
So I think psychological trauma is very much similar to what we see in younger populations, but let me just talk about geriatric trauma. I think because that is a very kind of different animal, and that really refers to the risk of injury for old people because of their failing health, because of problems with balance often. So one of the highest risks is falling.
Yeah.
Something like 1 in 3 elderly people fall during the average year. And falls can be anything from a minor slip to breaking a hip. Yeah. And I think often the issue is around maintaining good physical health and being really good about exercise. That makes a big difference. The other big risk factor is actually motor car accidents.
Oh.
And vehicle accidents.
Okay.
Yeah. Obviously, older people don't always have the same degree of concentration. They might also be struggling with problems with eyesight. And obviously, roads are quite difficult anyway for most people. And I think the other issue, certainly in South Africa, is we don't have good public transport systems for older people.
Yes.
Which is really, really a problem.
It's surprising that it hasn't been brought to their attention or really considered, that they could provide some kind of transport, just to help them in terms of like shopping and maybe spending time with the grandkids or whatever it is that they need to do, even visit friends, for example. And I've seen it where elderly people are still driving, and sometimes I worry. I'm like, anything can happen. I mean, anything can happen to any one of us. I don't think we are exempted, from going through any kind of ailment or sickness. But aging is a bit different. And I sometimes I see an elderly man or woman, driving, holding both steering wheels. And I think there was an incident where I can't remember where an elderly man actually, I don't know if he reversed or accelerated into a restaurant
yes,
where there were people, and quite a number actually died from that.
Yes, a serious accident.
Yeah.
Somewhere in Europe, I think.
Can't remember.
Norway.
Is it?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, but it was such a harrowing ordeal, and so, just to, in terms of what you just said, that, we don't have proper transport for them. Because if there has to be transport, I think money would have to be involved. And it's not always going to be conducive for the elderly.
I think that only really private care facilities have any kind of transport available to elderly people, which is really sad, because countries that provide good public facilities, including transport, elderly people stay independent for longer, they stay healthier for longer, their mental health is much better, because they can maintain independence, and also they have a sense of confidence about their ability to actually get on with their lives, compared to countries where there's less of that independence, and there's certainly less support, like South Africa.
No, and you're absolutely right. I think, it would be interesting, or it would be helpful, if I guess the country as a whole would be able to provide better systems for the elderly. I mean, we have systems, for example, going to the bank and they ask you to allow the elderly, but they need more than that, for example. And even with situations like that, I actually don't really see bank tellers encouraging like the elderly to come forward. As much as you can see it's written there, but whether it's practiced, that's a completely different story. And so, obviously, if there are people kind enough or empathic enough, they may consider. But a lot of people are now in their own world, and I don't want to say self-centered, but everybody's focusing on themselves, essentially. And, finding it hard sometimes to focus on other people who shouldn't necessarily stand for too long, or you find sometimes the elderly going to the shopping malls by themselves, and I saw a TikTok video where she opened somebody else's car and started putting her groceries inside, and that and shame, the other lady really had compassion and just said, can I help you? Because this is not your car. But I've seen other reactions where people are very explosive, and shouting and berating at this elderly person instead of just really looking at the situation, at the person, and just trying to offer some kind of help or assistance.
That's very much ageism, I think, reflection of ageism in society.
Okay.
I think it's also a shift away from, certainly, traditional African societies were much more respectful of elderly people, and they much more willing to integrate people into families and keep them in families, and they did better.
Yeah.
Nowadays, the practice is to shift people off to old age homes, to shunt them away, and it isn't good for their mental health, and it also makes them often quite lonely, quite isolated. We have changed our attitudes a great deal, and I think it's not always for the best.
Bringing up the topic of the old age homes, I think obviously, there are different perspectives regarding it, and everybody has their reasons. And I think you're highlighting something very important where people do feel isolated in spaces like that. Apart from the isolation, what else do you feel is detrimental or could be considered traumatic just being in a old age home?
So one of the factors that makes a big difference, and you can see this in different countries, impact. In the Netherlands, for example, people build old age accommodation into every building, every apartment building. So they aren't segregated from the general population. So there's a mix of old and young people. And that's what you don't get in old age homes. Everybody's getting older and getting more, more frail, and also perhaps more risk of dementia. And it isn't good for mental health of old people, because interaction with young people is so valuable for them, and also for younger people too. Yeah, that makes a big difference. The isolation, and I think also the sense of not being able to be active in the world as they were before. Where they were before. I think we need to encourage older people to really stay active as long as possible, and really focus on things like health and diet, and social connection is the other thing that's so important. Women are particularly better at it than men. Old men age much worse than women, partly because men are so bad at social connectedness, keeping connection with friends and family. So their rates of loneliness are much higher, and they're much more likely to attempt suicide, also to die younger.
You've just triggered a memory of something I'd watched as well, where there was a man that was doing a social experiment about the elderly being isolated and staying alone, and he tried it himself, no communication with the outside world, and he struggled. And I think he was just trying to bring to awareness how, and he had interviewed several elderly people as well, because that's their day-to-day life. And they don't have a choice. For him, it was an experiment, but it became other people's lifestyle, and they were just sharing how tough it's been, and some of them actually, I think, even admitted how they grew even older as a result of that kind of process, and not engaging, and you find that they're constantly on the couch or struggling to get out of bed. They have to cook for themselves, and when they're sick,
make
they can't
this effort.
cook. So, but how? And again, it goes back to the fact that yes, we can encourage them, but it can't be done necessarily in isolation, encouraging them. I think I would like you to share with all of us, how can we encourage everyone, I guess, to get the elderly, socially connected, active, getting involved in different kinds of activities. So how can we go about that, I guess, in a more holistic way?
That's a difficult question. I think because we live in silos so much of the time, little separate bubbles. But I think a lot of it has to do with maintaining connections, and I think finding ways to value old people. That they have something to contribute to community. They have wisdom. They have experience. Something worth sharing, and finding avenues to make that possible. For instance, mentoring of younger people. I think in Italy they do some of that, and it's been found quite a useful way of keeping old people active and also really in a far better mental state because they feel valued. They feel like they're making a contribution still. And younger people seem to value it as well. I'm talking about school children now who've been helped by older people.
Yeah, and that is amazing, being mentored by the elderly, and because they have a lot of life experience, and there's a lot of knowledge and wisdom that we can gain from them. Because I remember listening to my grandparents; it was always a fun time, always so much to learn, and you always wish and that they would be here long enough, because obviously they have so much that they have been through that you're not going to always get, because we live a busy life and they also go through things. So not it's not we're not going to always get the information that we want in a goal. But in a case where, because you did bring it up, that I understand it is a difficult question, but let's look at also a case where, for example, these elderly individuals now have children who have traveled overseas, right?
Yeah, immigrated often. Yeah.
Yes.
That's very hard.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because of, I think, lots higher social mobility nowadays. There's lots more immigration between countries, across continents. And I think the impact is that families are spread very, very far apart. Not just, outside South Africa, but also within South Africa. So there's a lot of fragmentation of family structures. And that leads to older people feeling much more isolated, much more lonely. I think for those who've had children who immigrated, often they can't even talk about how lonely they feel because they feel guilty about the children have gone for a better life. They should be happy about it. But at the same time, it's a loss for them. It's a sense of bereavement because they're not going to get to see their children and grandchildren very easily. I think one of the solutions is probably some kind of system for adopting elderly people.
Yes.
Adopt a granny or adopt a grandfather. And maybe making new connections between families and older people that don't necessarily logically related to them. That makes sense.
Would you say should the children who have immigrated should they facilitate that kind of process? Because I'm just looking at from the elderly's perspective, like it can be overwhelming, right? Obviously you want your children to prosper, to do well, and to excel in everything they're doing, but you're also sitting with that deep loss that life has changed so much. You're aging, your children are living their own lives, now you're sort of on your own or with your spouse, but it's different. It's a bit more quiet. There's not really much activities, and you can only speak to your children at certain times. Maybe there's a huge time difference, and sometimes people are sitting with that for such a significant amount of time, or for a significant period. And sometimes it's difficult to think, oh, I have to socialize, I have to do this. So who would be able to assist them to encourage those, activities, to get out more, to be adopted by either another family or neighbor, just to be able to help them?
I think social structures like churches, sports clubs, those kind of structures can be really important because often older people belong to them, and there is access to a wider range of people through structures like churches and religious organizations.
Yeah.
But also we seem to be much more isolated, I think, than ever before. We seem to have less social connection. I think that's really an issue for everybody, but certainly for older people.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think it really takes a toll on them mentally in that process, as a result of that. And you see them becoming, like you say, a bit more frail, and they struggle with a lot of things. And I think as time goes on, it becomes worse. And it's similar for a lot of people, financial related issues amongst the elderly.
That's a big stressor, yeah.
Yes.
I think those who've got money do much better because they can afford better health care, they can afford better accommodation, and they don't have the anxiety about worrying about finances.
Absolutely, yeah.
But the other things are very much around staying socially connected, being very conscious about making an effort to reach out to younger people. I think it needs to happen both ways.
Yeah, no, true. I know, I fully agree with you. And then I also wanted to ask you, Rob, aging just as a process, can that be considered traumatic for people sometimes?
Well, yes and no. I think it very much depends on the individual, and certainly for some people, it is a profoundly difficult and painful process. I think where health deteriorates, faster, where there are disabilities, also where bereavement happens, where somebody loses a partner or loses a lot of their social network, that is certainly much more painful.
Yeah.
But also it has to do with a lot to do with mental attitudes, mental perceptions of getting older. There's such a range of experiences from people who stop working and give up living and basically, are dead a year later, to people who in their 90s and still incredibly active. One of the people I wanted to talk about is a woman called Diana Atwell, who won a book prize, I think, at the age of 91. She wrote a book about getting older, and 91 years old, won a prize. She lived on to about, I think, 101.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And she did a wonderful documentary for the BBC called Getting Older Disgracefully, which is such a nice idea.
Can you tell us briefly about the book?
She had an interesting life. So she worked for publishers, Andre Deutsch, and they published a lot of very well-known authors from the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
People we probably know. So she was editing, helping writers, and didn't really have a life of her own. And when she retired, she started writing and discovered that she had a talent. And later on, she discovered that talking about her own life was meaningful for other people. And so she had these wonderful stories about relationships she had, about interesting people that had crossed her path, about having grown up, just on the I think before the First World War.
Oh,
yeah. So she lived from 1911, I think, until the early 2000s.
Okay, yeah.
So she had an incredible lifespan, and also she saw such incredible change in her life, and she was open to all of this happening. So just a fascinating mind, and also very engaging.
Sounds like it.
Yeah.
Please repeat the name of the book for our listeners and viewers.
So the book is called Somewhere Towards the End.
Somewhere Towards the End.
And it's Diana Atwell. Yeah.
Somewhere Towards the End. All right. So if anybody's interested, then they can definitely go, and I'm sure they can get in their local bookstores.
Or Amazon,
Or Amazon. Okay, great. No, I think that's a reader we'll definitely recommend to all our viewers, and hopefully they will, be able to get a hold of it and gain some.
I think it helps counter that idea that old age is always deterioration and painful and about loss, because it's also about gaining wisdom, accepting the past, not trying to fight it, not having to care so much what other people think about you, and also, I guess, being able to make choices, different choices, not necessarily having to work at something that you hate, but perhaps leisure activities that you have put off, engaging in, and maybe you have time now to do.
So there are two sides to the coin.
There's two sides to the coin, yeah. And also staying really active in terms of stimulating your mind. Some older people take to studying. I know of one person who did a psychology master's degree at the age of 70, which is quite astounding. But why not? Yeah, learning can carry on into very much old age. There's no limit to the age at which people can actually acquire knowledge.
You know why I'm laughing? My maternal grandfather was a medical doctor. He was still practicing at 70 something. And when my mother used to say, "Oh, your grandfather's in the hospital," I'm like, doing what? And I remember, I think, having a conversation with him, and I asked him, we call him Grandpa. I'm like, "Grandpa, why are you still working? Chill. Your kids they're working. They're all doing well. They're taking care of you guys." And I remember he made the statement of, "If I stop working, I'll die." And
I think that's true. My grandparents, in fact, I remember my grandfather he was a farmer, but he worked in a lawyer's office after he gave up farming, because he spoke very good Zulu. He came from KwaZulu-Natal.
Yeah.
And he stopped working at the age of 79. He retired. My granny stopped working at the age of 81.
Okay.
And I think it gave them a lot. They were active. They just were very, very active. They never stopped doing things. They never stopped doing. My granny never sat down. For example,
Yes.
she was always running around cooking for people. Hosting dinner parties, sewing, knitting, crocheting. All the things that people do, and looking after grandchildren. Had incredible boundless energy. She never had. I never saw her take a nap.
It gives them life, hey? And I think it reinforces what you had said then earlier in terms of them keeping active and having, social connections. And that's what I understood from my grandfather, that the minute you have to sit at home, you have nowhere to go. I think also, from that conversation I had with him, it's almost like you also lose your meaning in life. You
Your
also
sense
lose
of
yourself.
purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you lose a sense of purpose. Often men lose their sense of purpose when they retire,
Yes.
much more so than women, and they find it very difficult. And I think the reason is possibly because they don't have a plan for afterwards.
Yeah.
They're going to just sit around and maybe watch the daisies grow, and that isn't really enough.
And I mean, and they've been working for so long, and suddenly, one
Nothing.
day they have to, stop doing that. Obviously, they don't work the amount of hours they worked before, or or have as intense work as before, but it still gave them, motivation. It still gave them life. It still gave them something to look forward to, just being able to get out of bed, go to work, meet colleagues, empower the young ones, teach or lecture the younger generation. So and keeps them very active. And,
Yes,
and
yes.
you see the excitement, and that's what I would see in my grandfather as well. Just the excitement of just being in that space, medical medical space. But at least I got the comfort he wasn't doing things that he shouldn't be doing. Yeah, the work obviously was a bit less, and I think there was more teaching than anything. But yeah, just to move on a bit now, obviously as people get older, they need a bit more help.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
and whether that help is received well, it's a different story.
Yes.
I sit with a number of clients sometimes that are getting quite frustrated because there is that generation that is coming to terms with the fact that their parents are getting older and they are experiencing, like we spoke about, the geriatric trauma, the falling, becoming ill, eye operations, this and that. And there's certain decisions now, usually the children have to come together and start deciding what are they going to do, because this is what has become a would I say frequent issue amongst their parents or amongst their grandparents if they're also helping in that regard. So that decision to find help or find care for their parents, but sometimes we see that the parents or the elderly individuals don't take it too well. They feel like you're, I don't know, infringing on their rights, or you are getting somebody to babysit them sometimes, or you're getting a nanny, and they don't always feel like it's necessary, even though you as a child, or as the adult child, see that they really need more help. And we're living in a space where we don't have the communities that we used to have, back then, where we live in close proximity. You find that parents are living in Bobo, children are working in Joburg or Cape
Absolutely.
Town. And it's not always easy to rely on, for example, aunts and uncles or whoever, to be able to help and support your elderly parents. But, sometimes caregivers are brought into the picture, or children have to bring their parents to come and stay with them so that they can, watch them and ensure that they get their medical checkups regularly and so on and so forth. But it can be overwhelming for the caregivers. It can be
Yes, yeah.
overwhelming for the children of these elderly individuals, the adult children. So I think from that, I would like to know how best could caregivers, whether it's professional or whether it's from the family, could better handle situations like that, because I believe it's a huge transition, right?
Yeah. So I think that's a number of issues come up there.
Okay.
One is that often older people have mental health issues that are not really noticed or even diagnosed. And I think younger people need to maybe think of that as maybe a possibility. The reason why the person's difficult or resisting change is because the underlying mental health issues that are not really be addressed.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that they need to maybe be cognizant of, and maybe think of getting the person to see somebody who specializes in working with older people. The other issue is trauma. Trauma in older people often is not talked about very much.
Yeah.
They may complain about physical ailments, about not being able to sleep, having headaches, when actually there is a traumatic event they've experienced and they can't really, because of stigma, because of shame, really disclose it to younger people.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of hidden trauma.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So in cases like that, obviously people are not always informed, what to look for when an elderly individual has gone through a traumatic situation, whether it's current, present, or it's from the past, but there's certain things one notices as they're, I think, trying to take care of the elderly, whether it's excessive shouting or they become a bit aggressive with them. So how would you suggest, and you did, have mentioned the fact that, yes, they can take them to see a doctor or somebody to get their elderly parent assessed. Are there other things that they could do, just to manage the situation, especially when it becomes heated sometimes or things are escalating? What can, I guess, yeah, how can the caregivers or the children of the elderly be more mindful in such a space?
So I think very important is to share the burden. Often this burden seems to fall primarily on daughters, and usually one or two daughters, and that really is very excessive and also quite difficult. Yeah. So I think it's very important to share the burden amongst children, that they all take some responsibility for their parents or their elderly. Yeah. The other thing is to think of making use of faith-based organizations and churches. Often they have counselors, and I think there's less stigma talking to somebody in a church or a religious organization than perhaps talking to a mental health practitioner.
Yeah. Yeah, no, those are excellent ideas. And I'm glad you brought up about the daughter, sometimes having to take care of their elderly parents. You find that there's one daughter and they're like four sons. The four sons are nowhere to be found.
Absolutely.
They will send the money, but being present and fit. But I think that's a whole topic for another
topic.
Because I would love to talk about something along those lines with you. But we will get there. And I hope, our viewers and listeners will prepare for such a very interesting topic. But yes, there are some children or family members that really shoulder a lot of the responsibilities more than others, and it takes a toll on them mentally, financially, while others, I guess, are seemingly living their lives and doing what they need to do. But thank you for sharing that. I think that caregivers really need to be able to try and share the load, and maybe delegate some of the responsibilities so that it doesn't take such a huge toll on them. Because if they're becoming ill or greatly affected, they won't be able to have the patience or the empathy for their elderly parents.
Yeah.
And that again now brings up different kinds of issues. Support groups. Are there support groups in South Africa for caregivers or children who are helping to take care of their
I'm certainly not aware of formal structures. I mean, there certainly is a need, and I think that caregivers need debriefing, need a place to go and talk about some of the difficulties they struggle with, and also the emotional burden they carry. So I think there's definitely a need, but I don't think it's really addressed.
Yeah.
The other issue, I think, that talking about certain children carrying a lot of the burden of care for the elderly is often the next generation grandchildren, if they're old enough, can be drawn in. And I think it's not often thought about, is that grandchildren often have a better relationship with the elderly than sometimes the children do.
Yeah.
So that's something that can be tapped into quite productively.
Oh, most definitely. I mean, this topic, Rob, there's a lot there's a lot of subtopics that we have to, dissect. And but yeah, truly speaking, I guess the dynamics then become very interesting in terms of what we see, but it's based on different experiences. Obviously, the children are having one experience of their parent, while the grandchildren are going to have a different kind of experience with their grandparent. But yeah, I think the last question I would like to ask you for today, I mean, we can go on and on, Rob, and I would love to, I guess, is, what would you like, yeah, as a summary, what would you like people to gain from this conversation about trauma amongst the elderly? What would you like them to know? What would be the take-home message for them? We would like to know your thoughts.
I think there are a couple of key messages that I would probably want to pass on. One is that, particularly for older people who are in care facilities and they're more frail, be very much aware that they're at risk for abuse. Financial abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, and it is very prevalent in facilities for old people, especially when they are suffering from things like dementia.
Yeah.
That's one factor. I think the second one is older people often conceal trauma. They're much less likely to talk about it because they feel embarrassed about it, ashamed of it. And so we need to be just very much aware that physical symptoms can be a sign that their trauma has actually happened to an elderly person. Probably the third thing is that when younger people struggle with the elderly, it's very important not to feel alone and burdened by it, and reach out for help to others. Not just healthcare professionals and mental health professionals, but also to people in churches and religious organizations. Ask for help. Don't struggle alone.
No, definitely, Rob. Thank you so much for giving us that summary. And I really hope our listeners and viewers took a lot out of, this conversation.
Thank you for listening to the third episode in the Trauma Unpacked series, Trauma in Senior Citizens. If you'd like to hear more on the topic of trauma, we have other episodes in our Trauma Unpacked series available for you to listen to and watch on Spotify and YouTube.